All right, well, you may notice that the context of today's recording is a little bit different than the other sessions. We're not in the parish hall, we're in the nave. I'm here at the pulpit. And this is not a Sunday morning when I'm recording this. We had some technical difficulties with our computer a few weeks ago, and so I've had to re-record this, which is session 6 of our study, Stained Glass People. And I'm in the nave, mostly with myself and Duke Dutille. Our trusty videographer. So we're going to go through this same material, but this will be a little bit different than it would be if we had done it on a Sunday morning. And so if you were here in person for session 6, this will be a little bit different than what you remember. And obviously we don't have the questions and discussion that we would normally have. But just to catch up with where we are in the midst of a sort of two-part slide deck. I had too many to fit in one slide deck, with saints focusing predominantly on the British Isles and what I called the genesis of medieval Christianity. And what I meant by that is that especially the first two saints that we start out with today, Benedict and Scholastica, form the basis on which a lot of medieval Christianity will grow and flourish, especially monastic medieval Christianity. They become highly influential. So just to recap a little bit about what operative definition we've been using of what makes a saint or who a saint is. Mostly we've been talking about how a saint is both any baptized Christian who is a member of the communion of saints, but a saint is also somebody who has lived an exemplary life, a life of exemplary holiness. And the title of this class kind of gets us to think in that way, that the saints are not just people who we might commemorate in stained glass, but whose lives show forth particular aspects of God's grace in a unique way. And so saints are obviously not perfect people, we've talked about that as well, but rather people whose God's grace, who show us something about God and His grace and about how we can follow Jesus in a maybe better way or a different way. We've had a quote from William James that we've been referring to often about saints being the authors or increasers of goodness. He talks about St. Paul long ago making our ancestors familiar with the idea that every soul is virtually sacred. And since Christ died for all without exception, St. Paul said, we must despair of no one. The saints, with their extravagance of human tenderness, are the great torchbearers of this belief, the tip of the wedge and the cleavers of darkness. Like the single drops which sparkle in the sun as they are flung far ahead of the advancing edge of a wave or a flood, they show the way and are forerunners. The world is not yet with them, so they often seem, in the midst of the world's affairs, to be preposterous, yet they are impregnators of the world, vivifiers and animators of potentialities of goodness, which, but for them, would lie forever dormant. It is not possible to be quite as mean as we naturally are, James writes, when they have passed before us. One fire kindles another, and without that overtrust in human worth which they show, the rest of us would lie in spiritual stagnancy. And so this quote has sort of encapsulated all of these different facets of what a saint is or who saints are, as authors and increasers of goodness, as torchbearers of human tenderness who display God's love for all, as cleavers of the darkness in our world, and as kind of like spiritual innovators, forerunners who have shown us the way, gone before us to show us the way. And of course, many of them, including one of the people we talked about a lot in our last session, session 5, they are often preposterous and absurd to us in their pursuit of holiness and in their pursuit of getting closer to God, right? Of developing a deeper spirituality, such as Simeon, who spent his time up on the pillar, as we talked about last time in session 5. But they are animators of potentialities of goodness, which without them would lie forever dormant in our lives, as James puts it. So they inspire us, right? They're fire that kindles other fires. So we're going to talk about that today as we move into the 6th century, talking about, again, a group of saints predominantly living and working in the British Isles, many of which you're probably very familiar with. But before we do that, we have to pause and talk about Benedict and Scholastica. St. Benedict was born on the 3rd of March in 480, and he died the 21 of March in 547. And Benedict is incredibly important. Perhaps one of the most influential figures in this time period who will shape Christian practice for centuries and centuries, including our own Christian practice as Episcopalians. Because the Book of Common Prayer, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, which we use, it forms and shapes our worship and all of that. I mean, it is fundamentally a Benedictine book. The fact that we would have morning and evening prayer, noonday prayer, Compline, basically that our day would be punctuated with these times for prayer and the reading of Scripture. That is profoundly Benedictine. And so St. Benedict is even a part of our own spiritual lives today at St. Richard's. So Benedict, as I mentioned, was born around 480 as a son to a Roman noble. And he was said to have had a sister. Some people say she was his twin sister. Other accounts dispute that. But his sister was Scholastica, who we'll talk about right after this. In the 5th century, Benedict was sent to Rome to finish his education. And the subject that dominated his study was rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. For him, a successful speaker was not just someone who had the best argument or conveyed the truth, but actually someone who used rhythm, eloquence, and technique to sway somebody. So it was really an art. It wasn't just, it wasn't just the substance of what you said. It was how you said it, how you conveyed it. This was something that shaped Benedict and his learning. He grew up around other students who had everything open to them, educational opportunities, wealth, and they spent all of these things that they had, all of these material possessions they had, on pleasure instead of truth. And this bothered Benedict as he watched all of these vices kind of unravel the personal lives of his friends. So, caught up with this crowd of worldly students, he flees Rome, gives up his own inheritance, and lives in a small village with his nurse. And then eventually God kind of calls him into something deeper, this sort of deeper solitude. And so he goes out into the mountains. And, during this time, we've already talked about this, it was a common thing for folks to go off and be alone, to become hermits, live by themselves, to pray and pursue holiness in that way. But he didn't really feel that that was his calling in particular. And so eventually, after a bunch of other things happened in his life, which are worth reading about, but which we won't talk about today, he ends up founding a community of people, a community of Christians gathered around, again, a rhythm of prayer. Their whole day was based around these different times. They would wake up and pray together, say the Psalms together, but also of work, that you would live in community, and your work, every aspect of your life would be sort of in devotion to God. And as I said, this idea and the rule that he writes down, the rule of St. Benedict that he writes down, is just sort of the guidelines or the instruction manual, basically, for how this community was to live together, becomes hugely influential. A bunch of other monastic communities start to adopt this or a similar rule in their own lives, and it goes on to profoundly impact Christians all across Europe. And so, in fact, Benedict is referred to as the father of Western monasticism for this very reason. And we as Episcopalians are inheritors of that, as I said, through our own prayer book and the rhythms of prayer that are contained there. So that is Benedict. You can't really talk about any of the things that are about to come afterwards without talking about Benedict. And as I mentioned, he had a sister, some say a twin sister, named Scholastica, who was born either on the same day, if she was his twin, or at least around the same time that he was born. if she wasn't his twin, probably within a few years of his birth. And Scholastica is basically said to have done for women what Benedict did for men's orders, and founds her own community, and is an interesting figure to study because in iconography, including the photo that I have in my slide deck, Scholastica is often portrayed with a crozier in her hand, the shepherd's crook, which is a symbol often carried by bishops. And so she's portrayed in this way as a sort of shepherd of religious communities and is the patron saint of school, tests, books, reading, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Benedictine women's communities, which would make sense given her biography. So that's Benedict and Scholastica. So let's talk a little bit about some folks with whom you have probably heard and are no doubt familiar, beginning with perhaps the most famous saint in America of all, which is St. Patrick, where we all become Irish. Like one day a year, everybody suddenly has Irish ancestry. And I'm sure much to St. Patrick's horror, we drink a bunch of Guinness, and that's about it. That's sort of our observation of his feast day. But Patrick, along with Bridget of Kildare, who we're going to talk about in a second, and Columba, who we'll also talk about, are sort of the three saints of Ireland. Patrick was born in sometime around the year 385, and he died on the 17th of March, 461. He is the primary patron saint of Ireland, but as I said, shares that distinction with two other saints, Bridget and Columba. And he's probably one of the most famous saints, period. And his feast day, as I said, is still an occasion for merriment for many in this country and others. And Patrick had a very interesting life. He was born at the end of Roman rule in Britain. His birthplace itself is not known with any certainty. Some traditions place it in what is now England. But there's some dispute about that. We really don't know. In 1981, it was argued that he was born near Hadrian's Wall, sort of in the north of England, but again, that's been disputed. At any rate, his father is described as a senator or a tax collector of an unspecified British city of Roman rule or Roman occupation, and as a deacon. His grandfather was a priest, but Patrick's own life sort of deviates from that. Patrick himself was not an active believer in his youth, and in his own confession he talks about this. According to the Confession of St. Patrick, at the age of 16, he gets captured by a group of Irish pirates from his family's villa. And they are the ones actually who first take him to Ireland, where he's enslaved and held captive for 6 years. He writes that the time he spent in captivity was critical to his overall spiritual development, and explains that God during this time actually had mercy on his youth and ignorance and afforded him this opportunity to be forgiven of his sins and convert to Christianity, that this was this defining spiritual experience for him, being in captivity. While in captivity, he worked as a shepherd, and he strengthened his relationship with God through prayer. I guess, while you're sitting there tending sheep, you're praying. You've got, maybe if it's a slow day in the fields, I don't know. And this was sort of how he eventually finds himself a Christian convert. After 6 years, it's said that he hears this voice telling him that he's going to go home and that his ship was ready. And so he flees his master. He goes to a port and does find this ship waiting there in the port, and he persuades the captain of the ship to take him. And after 3 days, they land back in Britain, and he then walks for 28 days in the wilderness, becomes faint from hunger after this journey, and this is all part of sort of this not only physical journey back to his homeland, but also part of his spiritual journey as well. So he's walking back, trying to find his way back home, and he's famished, he's hungry, and there's a legend attributed to him that he prays at this moment for sustenance. And the group that he's with, these sailors, they encounter this herd of wild boar, and and so they're able to kill the boar and eat. And this becomes not only something that was miraculously attributed to Patrick, but also gains him credibility with these sailors because he'd been talking about how God would provide. And sure enough, there they are. There are the boar to eat. So then, sometime later, he has another vision. He sees this time a man coming to him. This time, the man's coming from Ireland. And the man's name is Victoricus, and with him he's carrying many letters. And he gives Patrick one of the letters, and Patrick reads the heading, the salutation on the letter, and it says, "The Voice of the Irish." And Patrick recounts that as he begins to read the letter, he imagines that he hears the voice of the Irish people calling him back. And they cry out, "We appeal to you, holy servant, to come and walk among us." And so this then motivates him to go back eventually. He does do some studying in the meantime at a variety of abbeys, and he gets ordained to the priesthood. So then he goes back to Ireland, this time a priest, and he lands in what is now County Wicklow. And tradition has it that he was very much not welcome back when he returns. This was not a warm welcome. The locals didn't want him to be there. Of course, at this time, most of Ireland is not Christian, and so he's there to missionize the pagans, and he's pretty controversial, actually. He, at one point, is brought before a magistrate. He has to go, he's kind of put in this trial, and has these accusations and charges made against him. And he ends up having to give back a lot of gifts that were given to him. He was accused of taking payment for baptisms and things like this. And anyway, and so he, yes, so it was not a happy time for Patrick, basically. So let's see. So Patrick missionizes Ireland. And it's said that thousands and thousands of people are baptized by Patrick there. And he even, the story goes, does convert the very people who enslaved him. Okay. Now, there are a lot of things that are attributed to Patrick. Lots of legends, lots of miracles, the most famous being him banishing all snakes from Ireland. But there are some other things, too, that are attached to St. Patrick. For instance, as he is on this missionary journey, he's pulling examples from what he has in order to make theological arguments or help teach about the Christian faith. And one of those things is taking a shamrock and using the shamrock to illustrate the Trinity, to be an illustration of the Trinity. And this is still something that folks will do from time to time. I've never seen it done at a Trinity sermon or Trinity Sunday sermon, but who's to say it couldn't be? Patrick used it, and it seems to have worked okay. But anyway, he becomes very, very famous and revered in the centuries after his death, and more things kind of get attached to him, including him going up on top of a mountain and praying and fasting, and this mountain is now what we call Croagh Patrick. And so a lot of sites in Ireland become associated with Patrick as well. So that is Patrick. And Patrick, as I said, Brigid, and Columba not only are all associated with Ireland now, but they are associated with one another both in terms of influence and sort of general overlap in times of when they lived. So let's talk a little bit about Brigid. Brigid was born a bit later than Patrick. Patrick, again, died in 461. Brigid is born in 451, so they overlap a little bit. Brigid's born around 451. We don't really know when she was born, and she died around 525. Brigid is one of my favorite saints. Bridget is one of my favorite saints that have to do with Ireland, but favorite saints, period. She is the patron of Kildare. She's the patron of babies, blacksmiths, brewers, midwives, poultry farmers, which is a very eclectic mix of people to be patron saint of. And she is the most beloved Irish saint alongside Patrick in the hearts of the Irish people. In fact, some of you may have either seen or maybe you have St. Bridget's cross in your home near your front door. It sort of looks like almost like a square thing with these four sides made out of reeds or sticks. But Bridget, very well beloved saint. Known as Mary of the Gale, she is said to have miraculous powers over beer, which also makes her a fabulous saint. One of the miracles attributed to her is that she changed a bathtub full of dirty water to beer to feed a starving family. So there you go. And caused a single barrel of her monastery's brew to last from Christmas all the way through Pentecost. So I guess it's like the oil in the lamps, but the Irish version of that is you have to have your beer last all the way to Pentecost. But her exploits were not limited only to mass beer production. She was also a gifted leader, and she led a double monastery, which starts to be a thing during this time, where you have monasteries that are comprised of both men and women. They live in separate quarters, obviously, but they worship in a shared space and that kind of thing. And she was in charge of a double monastery, which was at that time the first of its kind, but becomes much more common later on. One of the most famous stories about Bridget that I absolutely love is she needed land, obviously, to build the monastery on. So she goes to the king to request the land. She had the perfect spot picked out, and she knew exactly where she wanted it to be. It had trees, it had access to water, it was good for building on, the whole thing, right? Which was important in those days to have access to water and all of that if you had to be self-sustaining community. But the king refused. The king would not let her have this piece of land. And so instead of going away and just giving up, she suggests that the king give her just enough land as her cloak would cover. So just the land that her cloak would cover, which obviously the king thought was kind of a joke because her cloak was not very big. And so he says, okay, fine, yeah, I'll give you whatever land your cloak covers. And so the story goes that Bridget spreads out her cloak, and she hands each corner to a different nun who is there with her. And these attendants start sort of walking in opposite directions. And as they walk, the cloak continues to grow larger and larger and larger until the king, sort of annoyed and horrified all at once, throws up his hands in defeat, and he gives her the original piece of land that she had asked for. And so this whole story about her cloak becomes a really famous story of hers, and the pictures that often become attached to her, icons and things like that, including the one in the slide, depict her with this cloak with like little buildings and stuff on it to represent this how it spread out and covered this vast tract of land that she was able to build her monastery on. And in fact, a popular Irish blessing even today asks for St. Bridget to shelter you under her cloak. So still persists. Let's see. It is also said that when she was installed as abbess of Kildare, the St. Mel of Armagh, who performed her installation, reported seeing this column of fire descend from the heavens and alight upon Bridget's head, which was a vision that convinced him, it is rumored, to, on the spot, ordain her a bishop. Okay, ordain her a bishop. Now, some people dispute this, but again, she's often depicted with a crozier in her hand as well, the symbol of a bishop's rule. And so, because of that, though people do dispute whether or not she was ever a bishop, Bridget is considered by many today to be the first functioning female bishop and is depicted, as I mentioned, holding a crozier in many of her icons. Her ministry was defined sort of like Patrick's was. I mean, a lot of these missionary saints that you have in this time, a lot of her ministry was defined by translating the truths of the Christian faith into a language and an idiom that the people could understand, and helping incorporate their own traditional customs and practices into their newfound Christian faith. This goes also for the site on which she built her monastery, which was built on a site traditionally used for Druid worship of a pagan goddess. And worship of this goddess involved the kindling and tending of an eternal flame that just perpetually burned. And so once Brigid decided to build her monastery on that site, she actually elected to keep that practice in place. But instead of it being in honor of this Druidic goddess, Brigid explained that this was the light of Christ, shining in the world, coming to Ireland, and being God's presence there. And each day, a different nun would go and make sure that the flame stayed lit. And on the 20th day, Brigid herself would go out and tend to the flame. Now, when Henry VIII destroyed all the monasteries centuries and centuries later, the flame was extinguished. But I read that in 1993, the Order of Brigid relit the flame in Kildare, and apparently it is still burning today as a beacon of Christ's love in Ireland. So I think that's pretty cool. So I've already talked about a few miracles attributed to Brigid. She's got many, and they're all wonderful stories. She is celebrated and known for her generosity to the poor, and most of her miracles associated with her, the ones that don't have to do with beer, have to do with healing and kind of helping perform household tasks, usually attributed to women. And there's also a story about her brothers, Brigid's brothers, being really irritated and annoyed once she promised God a life of chastity. Her brothers were mad at her because they would lose her bride price. So there are a lot of miracles or stories associated with Brigid being involved in other women's lives in that way. Supporting them in the midst of a system that often exploited them materially. One of those being that when she was outside carrying carrying something past this group of poor people, some people began to laugh at her, and a man who was there derided her and said, "The beautiful eye which is in your head will be betrothed to a man, though you like it or not." And Brigid is said to have thrust her finger in her eye and basically plucked it out and said, "Here is that beautiful eye for you. I deem it unlikely that anyone will ask you for a blind girl." And it said that her brothers then tried to save her and wash away the blood from her wound, but there wasn't any water. And so Brigid asked them to put her staff in the sod. And after they do this, a stream bursts forth from the ground. And she then sort of threatens this man who threatened her and said, "Soon your two eyes will burst in your head," and then it happens as she said. It's sort of a gruesome story, but it's this kind of like idea of women caught in this oppressive system finding justice in these kind of significant ways. So those are the kinds of stories. You don't want to mess with Brigid, I guess is what I'm saying. Brigid was not someone to be trifled with, whether it's a land dispute or you're talking about dowries and bride prices. So that is Brigid. That is Brigid. I mean, there's so many good stories as I'm kind of looking through my notes. So many good stories about Brigid, including one where her blood is said to have had these healing properties. Anyway, but Brigid is an incredible saint who, again, still continues to have significant influence and sort of staying power in the national minds of the Irish and beyond. So that is Brigid. Okay, so we've done Benedict, Scholastica, Patrick, Brigid. Let's move on to David of Wales. Okay, so we're going back across from Ireland to Great Britain now. And David of Wales is the patron saint of Wales, as his name would tell you. He was born around 500 and he died on the 1st of March 589, so he lived a pretty long time by any account, not just by ancient standards, but also by modern ones as well. He lived a long time. And even though he is the patron saint of Wales, not a whole lot is known about him. Much that we do know about David, we know from legend, not really from historical accounts of the time. But he was a really important figure during his lifetime. He himself was a monk who lived in Wales in the 6th century. He founded a monastic community there where they sort of observed the Celtic monastic tradition, which connected the people of Wales with Ireland, Cornwall, France, and the Scottish Isles. And he drew his followers from all over Wales. He traveled a lot, walked around and preached a lot. And in fact, one of the most famous stories or miracles attributed to him has to do with his preaching as he traveled, where he was speaking at a synod, a gathering of church leaders, and the earth beneath his feet rose up, it is said, to create this hill so that his words could be heard better and he could be seen in the midst of the crowd. And this is one of the miracles attributed to him. The earliest known life of St. David was written by a monk whose name is Welsh, and I am not going to pretend to try to pronounce it. It's got a lot of Y's and consonants in there, lots of G's and a whole bunch of things I don't know how to say. But it was written about about 500 years after his death, David's death, around 1080. And was based largely on oral traditions and memories of David's sayings that had been preserved throughout the successive centuries. And so, again, we don't know much about David himself from his time, but it was clear that he had significant influence on folks folks in Wales and beyond during his life. Let's see. Some legends about St. David, though. So even though we don't know much about his life biographically speaking, there are some legends that still exist of his life. They give us some sort of picture of who he was and how he lived in the consciousness of the folks with whom he lived and served. He is understood to have performed a lot of miracles of healing. This was one of the sort of saintly qualities that he possessed. And there are a number of, what do you call it? A well, St. David of Wales, but a well where you draw water that are attributed to places where he healed people. So the water that came forth or sprung forth from the well had these sort of healing properties, miraculous properties of healing. But there is one story that I found really interesting when reading about St. David that doesn't have to do with water or healing, but has to do with bees, of all things, bees. So there was an Irish monk who was a beekeeper in David's monastery, and he made honey and wax. This was common because you had to get your candles from somewhere, so you'd often have bees. And so this guy had to return to Ireland, but his bees kept following him to the boat, and they didn't, need to do that. They needed to keep the bees. And 3 times this guy brought the bees back to the monastery until finally David blessed the bees and allowed the beekeeper to take them with him, which is reportedly how honeybees got introduced to Ireland. So Patrick banished snakes, and David introduced honeybees. So that was, I guess, I don't know, that was the trade. So that's one of the legends attributed to David. Let's see. He was, as I said, he was a monk. He had a monastery, and there was a group of sort of movement, if you will, among monks, which perpetuated for many centuries, that believed that you should only drink water, which was actually very rare for the time because water, oftentimes, unless it came from the right place, could really make you quite ill. And so one of the reasons why you drank beer often was to be more sanitary than drinking water by itself. But David oversaw a group of monks who believed that you should only drink water. They believed that you should plow your fields yourselves without the use of animals, so they did that. They ate one meal a day of bread and herbs or vegetables. So it was a very Spartan life that David lived and lived for so long. And this witness of their way of life stood in stark contrast to the chieftains and others in the wider church who expressed their power and status through their lavish banquets and feasting and that kind of thing. And so this becomes actually part of what inspires people about David, is his simplicity and devotion to Christ. Even though David was a bishop, an archbishop even, he lived so simply, and this endeared him to people. Thus, people were drawn to him and his miracles not only during his lifetime, but also after he died, which is part of how he becomes so associated with Wales as a place. And his legacy is exemplified and summed up perhaps best in what is believed to be his final words, which were, "Be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things that you have seen me do." To do the little things, the little things. And this was what really defined David's ministry, was that he believed that in doing these little things to follow Jesus, that was not only enough, but that was honoring, that it was not necessarily in the big showy things, but in just the small disciplines of life that one lived out their Christian faith. So that's David, and that brings us to our third saint of the British Isles, we'll say, which is Columba. Columba of Iona. And Columba has some overlap with David, actually. David, and we'll see this in the next session as well, how these saints in their lives impacted and influenced the lives of those who would come later. So Columba was born he was born on the 7th of December, 521. We actually know the date of his birth, which is rare for this time period. And he died the 9th of June, 597. And he is credited with spreading the Christian faith to Scotland. He was an Irish abbot and missionary. So sort of like Patrick, even though he's associated with Ireland, was not actually Irish. Columba's associated often with Scotland, but he wasn't actually Scottish. So there you go. He founded a very important abbey on Iona, which you can go to still today, which becomes a dominant religious and political institution for many, many centuries, a real center of learning. Like most of the monasteries in this time, they were centers of learning and education and the propagation of knowledge, the copying of texts, not just Bibles and holy books, but also any kind of text that had, you couldn't print it. You had to write it out by hand. And so this happened in monasteries. He is the patron saint of Derry and was highly regarded by many of the sort of pagan folks in which he worked and missionized. And he is remembered today as one of the, quote, 12 apostles of Ireland. During his life, he reportedly studied under some of Ireland's most prominent church figures, and he founded several monasteries there in that country. Around 563, he and his 12 companions crossed over to crossed over. They end up eventually in Scotland. They make a few stops along the way. And they found a new abbey there as a base for spreading Christianity among the northern Pictish kingdoms, who, as I mentioned, were all pagans. Though he was in Scotland, he did remain active in Irish politics, and 3 early medieval Latin hymns are maybe attributed to him. So he's also a hymn writer as well. Let's see. I have a lot of information here. So let's see. So one of the connections that he has with St. David is that Columba is educated at a monastery, as many were, which was governed by that time by St. Finian, which is where he imbibed the traditions of the Welsh church because Finian had been trained in the schools founded by St. David. So again, it's not just an influence in terms of like, Columba heard the story of St. David and was inspired by his witness, but actually the institutions that St. David created educated other folks who then made disciples of other folks who made disciples of other folks, and that's how. And then you have Columba, right? So, so Columba was educated at a place and by someone who had been trained in the schools of St. David that St. David had established and founded. Let's see. The place where Columba studied is very interesting. I mean, these were not small operations, some of them. The monastery where Columba studied is said to have had over 3,000 people present in it at the time. So that's pretty significant. And Columba was ordained to the priesthood. Let's see. He runs, so as I mentioned, he was trained by St. Finian. He was a pupil of St. Finian, but tradition asserts that sometime around 560, he becomes involved in this dispute with St. Finian over a psalter, a copy of the Psalms. And this is kind of a rift in their relationship, but it also grows so significant that it is said to have been the origination of a battle. A battle that, again, I'm not going to try to pronounce because the whole thing is in some sort of Celtic. Can't even presume to say this correctly. But during this, many men were said to have died in this battle over the Psalter. And Columba felt bad about this. He sort of felt that this shouldn't have happened. And folks were upset about it. Other clergy were mad about it, and a synod of clerics and scholars gathered and threatened to excommunicate him, sort of holding him liable for the deaths of these men in this battle. But St. Brendan spoke on his behalf, with the result that he was allowed to go into exile instead. And that is sort of part of what motivated his leaving Ireland, and part of what motivated his mission work after that. A story associated with him that I find to be really interesting is his association with the Loch Ness Monster. In 563, Columba traveled to Scotland with 12 companions, right? I mentioned that. And they get there, and according to legend, as they're traveling up the north, traveling north up the west coast of Scotland, let's see, they're going along there. Oh my gosh. Well, why did my notes just end? That is very frustrating. Got to pick that back up. Yeah. Here we go. Okay, for some reason my notes got out of order. I don't really know what's going on there. But, so there is an association with Columba. The Loch Ness Monster. He apparently has a run-in with the Loch Ness Monster. As he and his companions are traveling up, as I said, into Scotland, they come across a group of Picts, who are the pagan folks who live there, and they're burying a man who had been killed by this monster that lives in the lake / in the river next to the lake. And Columba is said to have saved a swimmer from the monster by making the sign of the cross and saying, "Thou shalt go no further nor touch the man. Now go back with all speed." And then the story says that the beast flees, terrified, to the amazement of the assembled people there, and this actually causes the people who are gathered, these pagan Picts, to convert to Christianity because he blesses the Loch Ness Monster and it flees. And yes, so that's a pretty cool tie-in there. But most of what we know about Columba's life comes from a book called the Vita Columbae, the Life of Columba. which is a hagiography written in a very common style of the saints' lives. There were a lot of these that circulated around the lives of the saints that people would read or share stories from as not just a way to record historical detail, perhaps, but actually more to inspire belief, to inspire others' belief. And so the life of Columba is broken up into multiple sections called books, and book 1 contains these sort of prophetic revelations or sayings that Columba had. And then book 2 is this stories of Columba's miracles, including the story that I just shared about the Loch Ness Monster, but other things too, such as he healed people who had diseases, he expelled malignant spirits from people, he calmed storms, and it is even said that he returned the dead to life, that he sort of possessed the power to resurrect people. Columba also performs agricultural miracles because, again, at the time, a lot of the miraculous acts have to do with being able to have food in times of famine or things like that. Think of like Bridget turning the bath water to beer for this poor family. And Columba's version of that is that there is a pail of milk that is spilled, and Columba is said to have cast a demon out of the pail, which must have been what caused the spill, obviously. Every time I spill my glass of whatever, I always blame it on a demon myself. So Columba is said to have exorcised the demon, and he restores the spilt milk to its container somehow. And this is one of the miracles attributed to him. And then, so that's book 2, or these miraculous acts. And then book 3 is this interesting section that talks about these apparitions that both Columba had, like apparitions of angels appearing to Columba, but also apparitions of Columba to other people, like other people report Columba appearing before them. And it's a really fascinating stories of him appearing, for instance, to those who had exiled him or something like that. And it is in this last chapter that Columba is said to have foreseen his own death. And he says, "This day in the Holy Scriptures is called the Sabbath, which means rest. And this day is indeed a Sabbath to me, for it is the last day of my present laborious life. And on it I rest after the fatigues of my labors. And this night at midnight, which commenceth the solemn Lord's day, I shall, according to the sayings of Scripture, go the way of our fathers. For already my Lord Jesus Christ deigneth to invite me, and to him I say, in the middle of this night shall I depart at his invitation. For so it hath been revealed to me by the Lord himself." And so the story goes that after he sort of foretells of his death, he goes in the chapel, in the church, and he kneels beside the altar, and when the bell strikes midnight, it is recorded that the person who's there with him sees this heavenly light descend upon Columba. Holy angels join the saint, and it says, "And having given them his holy benediction in this way, he immediately breathed his last. After his soul had left the tabernacle of the body, his face still continued ruddy and brightened in a wonderful way by his vision of the angels, and that to such a degree that he had the appearance not so much of one dead, but as of one alive and sleeping." And so Columba goes to his greater glory there praying at the altar, which is a way that actually a number of saints are said to have gone. There are a few others that we will discuss in subsequent sessions of this study, but that we have already discussed because I'm recording this after I've discussed them. But there are other saints who die similarly, or are said to have died similarly in the act of worship, whether praying at the altar or maybe celebrating the Eucharist or what have you. That's one of the things that can oftentimes define a saintly death, is that they've died in worship. And so there we have it. Session 6, focusing on the saints of the British Isles and sort of laying the groundwork for medieval Christianity, especially medieval monastic communities, and the influence that they will have. And of course, all of these saints that we've talked about become patron saints of the places in which they are associated and still continue to have influence today. So I know that this session was a little bit different. I hate that we don't have the same kind of energy of the room or questions and discussion. But hopefully it sparked something in you. Hopefully one of these stories interested one of you and prompts you to read more, because there is always more to read about each of these saints that we look at in the class. So Duke, do you have any questions? Okay, great. All right. Well, are we done? I guess we're done. Should I do like a little sign off? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll do a prayer. All right. Well, let's conclude with a prayer. Let us pray. Lord of power and might, I thank you for your great glory and the way that it is shown to us in the witness of the saints. I pray that you would continue to inspire us by their example, that you would help us to see ways that, like, for instance, St. David, that even in the little things that we do, that there is faithfulness and holiness to be found. I pray that you would go with us, you would help the ground rise to meet us, and that we would remember that you are always with us on the journeys that we take. For it's in your name that we pray. Amen.